record to the cloud. We are here for day 2 of our carbon markets workshop. Yesterday, we heard from a number of people representing project developers, Forrest carbon project developers. Heard a lot about how their programs are structured, how monitoring happens, how payments happen, the scheduling of contracts, and all sorts of different things, technologies used to make it happen. And today we're going to hear from kind of the other side of the equation. We're going to hear from several folks who are on the landowner side or selling carbon offset markets to the marketplace. And we're going to hear about their experiences, how things have gone for them, how it worked, you know, what approximately, not every single step, but you know, how they got enrolled and what lessons they've learned and so forth. The morning will be structured with, we've got four speakers. Each of them will have up to about 15 minutes to share some prepared remarks about the things I just mentioned. After that, we'll take a break, and then we'll do we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So I think my slides are displaying here. As yesterday, I want to acknowledge and thank the Minnesota Forest Resources Council for their support of this series. MFRC funds have helped us to be able to put this on, and we're grateful for that. We also, and as I was just saying, the agenda, we're in a couple of minutes here, I'm going to hand the screen to Craig Halla, but we've got just a brief introductory remarks. Then we'll hear for about an hour, a little more than an hour, from our 4 panelists. You can see their names listed here: Craig Halla with Molpus, Quintin Legler with UPM-Blandin, VandeLinde with the Minnesota Office of School Trust Lands, and Forrest Gibeault with Steigerwaldt. So we'll hear from the 4 of them. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back for Q&A. Just like yesterday, we're asking that you, if you have questions, post them anytime. We prefer that rather than posting them to the Zoom chat, that you post them to Slido. I'm about to paste the link into the chat. Excellent, Matt beat me to it. Thank you, Matt. The Slido link is right there. So that CMark QA, that's where you want to post questions and answers. If you haven't done it, it's very easy to do. And in addition to posting your question, I really encourage you to go and, you know, upvote other questions. If you go and you see a question that someone else has asked that you're interested in, give it a thumbs up. That helps Matt and me to know that, you know, we should be sure to ask that question. Yesterday, we had many more questions than we were able to fully answer. So please do go there and let us know what questions you want to have answered. With that, again, any questions for us kind of behind the scenes, feel free to use the Zoom chat to, you know, for technical questions and things like that. Watch the chat for links that mainly Matt, but Matt and I may post, and others, you know, to information or other, you know, links and resources relevant to the content. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Craig, you are up first. I know that you're not planning to share slides, so you're not going to share your screen. And I guess that reminds me, I should mention to all of you out there watching, you do have a few view options. If you click the upper right corner of your Zoom window, you probably know this by now because we've all been on Zoom a lot over the last year and a half, but you can make Craig fill the screen, or if that's too much for you, you can make him an inch tall, or shoot, you can hide him behind a different window. You can do whatever you want, but you do have some view options, side by side or gallery or different views in the upper right corner of your screen. I just wanted to mention that before Craig gets going. Craig, the screen is yours. You look like you're talking, but you're muted. There you go.
Very good. I think I'm live now.
You are. You
morning.
sound good.
Good morning.
Great.
Good morning, everyone. As Eli mentioned, I work for the Molpus Woodlands Group. We are a timber investment management organization, or a TIMO. I'm actually, I have 2 hats. I'm the property manager for 286,000 acres here in Minnesota. And I'm also the Northern Region Director for about 750,000 acres, including Minnesota, the UP of Michigan, and upstate New York. Molpus as a whole manages 2.1 million acres in 16 states. And I will say that we started looking at carbon in 2017, primarily started looking at carbon for one main reason, and that was to deal with mill closures and stumpage price decline in some regions. And we just thought it prudent to look elsewhere to diversify our investors or our clients' assets. So I am happy to say that we now have verified carbon projects in Michigan, upstate New York, and in Minnesota. We also have voluntary projects in, I think, the South and in the East. So, but for today's presentation, I'll concentrate on the Minnesota property. So it is a verified project with the California Air Resource Board. It is a 99-year project. So it is a long-term project. We first started looking at carbon in Minnesota in 2017. We hired a carbon developer, or contracted with a carbon developer. We sent the carbon developer our operational inventory. They did some work with modeling and really came up with a projection of how much carbon we actually had on the property, and that gave us a little look at what kind of carbon stocks we'd have to sell. We also, after receiving this estimate from our carbon developer, we also hired a appraiser. And the reason we hired an appraiser is we really needed to get an appraisal opinion of what carbon encumbering our land to carbon project of 99 years, what that would actually do to the value of the land. And that's important because in a timber investment world, at some point, the property is going to be divested. And so that was a real key part of the equation that we needed to evaluate. So with those two things in hand, we basically evaluated internally. And when we agreed that we'd move forward, we took that to our clients. We took both those things to the clients and reviewed it with them. And in the end, they approved going forward with the project. In 2018, we started work with our developer. We hired a contracting company, and for as it turns out, they're on this panel, and we hired them to do a carbon inventory. A carbon inventory is much more in depth than a standard inventory. Not only does it cost 4 times as much as a standard inventory, but it's very key to getting the project approved by the California Air Resource Board. So I believe in 2019, late in 2019, we started and completed the inventory. And basically it's a strata type inventory that covers all cover types of the property involved and plots on each of those cover types or strata. And then that information is then multiplied out to your ownership. As I mentioned, it's very key to the whole process, because if you don't have an accurate inventory, you're not going to be approved by the California Air Resource Board, and it's just key to the project. So I believe in 2019, late in 2019, we got that completed. In 2020, back up in 2019, we sent in the applications to the California Air Resource Board. So we did all the paperwork there. The next part of the process was to actually have verifiers come to the property and verify the inventory. There was a lot went on behind the scenes with sending shape files of the property involved and back and forth with the California Resource Board, but really it came down to the verifiers coming, and I believe the verifiers were from the Northeast, but they came or were supposed to come in the spring of 2020. And about that time, COVID started to kick in, and we had some delays. So with those delays, we moved into 2021. And in the spring of 2021, we were to have the property verifiers come to the property. However, we were afraid that because 2 years or a year and a half had lapsed, we might not have the diameters or the heights right on trees. So we went back to our contractor, our inventory contractor, and we paid them a little bit more money to come up and to kind of go over our inventory and make sure that all the data was correct. So in the spring of 2021, we had the verifiers come, and in the end, our project, they approved the inventory, and then that got sent back to the California Air Resource Board, and our project was really approved. So at that point, we knew we had a project. We knew the acreage. It was basically 60% of our ownership here in Minnesota. And so, what did that all mean? So once the project was approved, we got tons of carbon, and that we could take to the market and sell. And that was what we classify or call our initial payment, and that's based on the carbon stocks of your inventory of the forest that you have enrolled. So I'll move on. See if I missed anything important, but I'll move on to some of the challenges that we ran into. And I'm no way, shape, or form an expert on carbon, and I have learned a lot in the last 3 years, and I can tell you that there are a lot of challenges with having a carbon project on your property. The first challenge, I guess, was the answer to the question of the sustainable harvest. And for us at Molpus, that really is not an issue, because this property has been SFI certified for a long time, and we're fairly confident that we've managed the property sustainable. So we weren't really afraid that we would have to over harvest, because we've not over harvested the property in 20 years. So that brought up taking a look at the Air Resource Board's management guidelines. And one of the guidelines is you cannot have a clear cut of any greater size than 40 acres. Well, for us, that was cutting our average clear cut size just about in half. I guess prior to carbon, we were averaging about 78 acres per clear cut. So, that in itself added some complexity to our planning process. So once we got over that hump and we did a lot of planning, we looked at the adjacency. So with carbon, you need 2 full growing seasons or 5 feet of growth before you can harvest an adjacent stand. So very similar to SFI's green up rules. However, in SFI, you just need to have 5 feet of growth. With carbon, you need to wait 2 full growing seasons or 5 feet. So basically, it's 2 full growing seasons with our aspen. Our property is 52% aspen cover type, so fortunately, we don't have an issue with meeting 5 feet on any of our aspen sites. So, you know, aspen is not really an issue with us, but we have 14% of our ownership in black spruce. And as you all know, black spruce is very slow growing, and it takes about five years before you get 5 feet of growth. So the adjacency for our black spruce stands sort of became complicated, and we needed to do a GIS exercise to make sure that you know, what we were planning to harvest in the next 10 years really matched what we could do, because you can harvest in some cases we couldn't harvest mature black spruce adjacent to carbon for up to 5 or 7 years. So that in itself created some challenges and probably reduced our annual amount of black spruce we could sell. Let's see.
Craig, just while you're thinking there, quick time check. You've got 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, we're good. I just wanted to make sure I hit on some of the important points that I guess folks would find interesting. One of the last things I will mention is one of the other challenges we have is we're entirely stumpage sales, and they're 2-year or 24-month contracts. And one of the big challenges was to sell enough timber to make our harvest revenue targets and budgets, but not have any more cut in any one year to go over our allocated sort of sustainable harvest. And that doesn't sound like much, but you're kind of balancing 2 important things there. And we do, as the property manager, I don't want to be the one that exceeds the carbon harvest. So with that, I think I will mention that once annually, we are in reporting period 3. So you know, we've been living this for 3 years. I guess what we send in annually is shape files of all of our harvests to verify that for the verifiers to verify that we're not exceeding the 40-acre rule, and also the adjacency rules. And also we send in 100% of our mill scales, which is a lot of loads. And that's to verify the volume that I report is actually accurate from what we send to the mills. And with that, I'm sure I missed something, and I'm sure I rambled a little bit, but that's pretty much my presentation.
Craig, excellent. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's good overview, and I appreciate your sharing the Molpus experience. We've got a couple of great questions coming in, and as I look at the questions, I'm reminded, and we're not doing questions now, but I'm reminded of something I forgot to say, but those of you posting questions reminded me of it. Please do include the name of the panelist who you want to respond to that question. And yeah, a couple of good ones there that we'll come back to after the break. But Craig, thank you very much. Next up, we've got Quintin Legler. Quintin, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen. I see that you're unmuted, so the screen is yours.
All right. Huh.
And it looks like they're coming up. I see you clicked it.
There we go.
Great.
Oh,
Oh yeah, you need to swap. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. You're on it. Yep. Yep, there we go. Looks, yep, you're muted now, Quintin, but we're seeing your slides just fine.
I suppose when I grabbed the Zoom bar to move it, I did the mute at the same time.
Yep.
Okay, new things I've never had happen before. Great. Well, I'm the Forest Resources Manager at UPM-Blandin. I'm just going to give you a little talk about our carbon project. And so the okay, it's not advancing for me. Sorry.
You may just need to tap somewhere on the slide, and then I think
Okay.
it'll work. There you go.
There we go. I think I went too far. There we go. So it all started out back in 1997. The genesis of the process was, we were purchased by UPM. We recognized that the clearing of hardwoods to put spruce plantations wasn't economical or ecological, and this development of what we registered as a service mark called smart forestry, which is essentially an ecological forestry system. So with UPM's purchase of it, they had these key sustainability criteria. And so these were things that, we were looking at and started to look at more intently. And in 2009, they started looking at, should we do a carbon project? They started looking at it from a corporate standpoint. And these were some of the questions that they were asking. And I think, Craig hit on some of these too, is what is it a market? Is it something they can take to the marketplace? What's the market? How's the process work? Is it going to add to that forest asset? And so out of that was the UPM-Blandin Native American Hardwood Conservation and Carbon Sequestration Program. And so it differs from what Craig described. A lot of the process is the same, but in this case, we're in a voluntary market versus the compliance market. And you can see what the project itself was. The goal is, we're going to promote long-lived conifers where they're appropriate, the right native plant communities. We're going to minimize or eliminate the plantation conditions over time. And that's essential because we were putting those on, like I said, hardwood sites that naturally didn't have spruce. And then increase our, the cohort size and the cohort, diversity. And we really wanted to have a more diverse forest. And then when it's possible to extend some rotations. So we're in the American Carbon Registry. Our carbon project developer was Terra Carbon. That's who we used. And with this voluntary project, our crediting period is 20 years, but the term is 40 years. So it's shorter than what Craig was describing, for the compliance market. And so it's pretty much some of the same discussion that Craig had. Is you start off with that carbon inventory, a more intense sampling. The developers looking at all your inventory and everything, comes up with the calculations, what they're going to be able to do. You have a verification to prove that. And with the ACR, the American Carbon Registry, every 5 years, we actually have to have an on-the-ground inventory conducted to double check our carbon plots. So we'll have a contractor remeasure those. All that goes in through that verification. In this case, that picture there is actually from last fall, when the folks from out east that were contractors actually for the company that was doing the verification came on site, and then they would check, like, the different strata. They're based on your acreage in each strata, like Craig mentioned. You've got percentage in the different strata, the different species, and what they have to do is they do the subset that replicates those there. And this this was the first plot that we did, just to make sure everyone was on the same page. And we had a bit of a problem, like Craig said too, is because this was supposed to happen in early spring, late winter of 2020, and with COVID, then that didn't happen. And so when we were able to do it, the forest had grown already. And so then we were in that same situation. And basically what based on our inventory and that we had, they were able to grow the forest forward. So that added a little more of that complexity to, okay, this is when it was measured. And now, so it was actually in 19 after the growing season. And now we didn't get it measured before it started to grow in 20. And so how are those plots going to match up? And so that was a little bit of a challenge as well. But, when we looked at it, it was a perfect fit for, doing a carbon project, because the smart forestry objectives, fit really well with what we needed to do or wanted to do for the climate or the carbon project. And as I mentioned there, UPM has climate positive forestry and biodiversity goals, and it fit well with those. And so it was pretty, I think I wasn't involved in it, but it seemed like it was pretty much a no-brainer that this is a way to go. And like Craig said, it adds some value. It adds a revenue stream to help do more and better forest management. And that's all I have. I had to make up for Craig's time. I'm just giving him a hard time.
All right, thanks, Quintin.
Stop share. There we go.
Great. And Matt has just put a couple of links in there too about Blandin and so on. Great. So similar process, Quintin, a little bit different. You mentioned that you're, different project developer and different term of your contracts, but more or less similar in approach. So thank you for that. We're going to move next to Aaron VandeLinde. I see that you're unmuted. And Aaron, you can go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready.
I'm working on it, but it's not letting me get to my
Well, just
PowerPoint
like
for
with
some reason.
Quintin, things never go wrong until you've got an audience
Yep, exactly.
watching. Boy, this is interesting. Now you're sharing your screen and I'm seeing two versions of my face for some reason.
Should have switched it already. Did you got my screen up yet?
Maybe I'm
with the
locked up.
PowerPoint?
I'm not seeing your screen. I'm seeing you and hearing you fine, but I'm still seeing your screen.
All right.
You have a couple of options for sharing. It's actually a little bit better to share the particular window, Aaron, rather than sharing your
Oh
whole
yeah, I
screen.
tried that, Eli. It just didn't give me that option.
Oh, okay.
There we go. I got it this time. It didn't pop up the first time. Sorry about that.
No problem. Yeah, great. So
Of
now
course,
we're
it worked in our
seeing slide
technical review, but
Yeah, there you go.
and Craig, I'm not counting that as part of my 15 minutes. So thanks for having me, Eli. I really appreciate it. And I'll just start real quick with just dispelling any rumors. Minnesota school trust lands, we do not have a carbon project yet, like UPM-Blandin and Molpus that you heard just before. We are at the initial stages of trying to do an assessment on a carbon project. So just a real quick background on school trust lands. I'll talk about our forest assets and then talk about our offset opportunities or the assessment that we're working on, and then some of the challenges that we had to fix with legislation. So real quick, Minnesota school trust lands, for those that don't know, these were granted to the state right around statehood or shortly thereafter. We ended up with 8.1 million acres. Today we have about 2.5 million acres, and most of those lands are in northeastern Minnesota. So 2.2 of the 2.5 million acres are in, mainly Cooch, Itasca, and St. Louis County are our big counties. So part of my job as the school trust lands director is to work on strategic direction for school trust land management. And the way I've approached that really is to look at some new economic opportunities on school trust lands, so that we have our traditional mineral development, forestry, and real estate projects, but what other economic opportunities are out there where we could generate revenue for school trust lands. The revenue does funnel back into K through 12 education on an annual basis. So I think it's pretty important for our current beneficiaries and our future beneficiaries to make sure that we're doing what we can to identify revenue streams. So part of that strategic direction and what I have highlighted on this screen is something that started about 2.5 years ago, and it's our asset management plan. And really what we're trying to do is create a 25-year framework that's really going to guide how we manage school trust lands in Minnesota. And when I mean we, I mean the Department of Natural Resources. They have management authority over those school trust lands. My role is really to set the strategic direction in conjunction with the DNR. So that plan is in its final draft stages. It's going through internal review right now, and we will be rolling it out for stakeholder review and tribal review in the very near future. So just real quick, since we're talking about forestry, I just wanted to put this on here, what the economic value is from school trust lands. And just if you look at Minnesota's forest product industry, it's the 5th largest manufacturing sector. It provides roughly $18 billion in economic impact for Minnesota, and a lot of that revenue comes off of school trust lands through the state's management. Another opportunity that what we're looking at is the ecological values that these school trust lands provide to the state as a whole. And in relation to forestry, they are carbon sinks. I think we all know that. And I'll get to this a little bit. I'll a little bit later on, but what we're seeing right now in our assessment is where we could store roughly 40 metric tons of carbon in our forests per acre. So peatlands considerably higher, roughly 750 metric tons per acre. So we have considerable amount of peatlands as well. So those are some of the ways we're looking at analyzing or finding those new economic opportunities. Just a quick slide on where we have identified what the wood basket is for school trust lands, and you can see those. Hopefully, you can see the circles on the screen. Most of our wood basket is in Cass, Bemidji, Itasca, and Cooch County. You can see those circles, and those are all within 50-mile radius of a mill. So that's, from what I understand, very important to the carbon developers and the verifiers, so that they can determine what your allowable cut is and what would be cut in relation to the mill locations. So of those core forestry areas, we have roughly 2.5 million acres, but 1.5 million acres of it is what we consider a productive forest. So, Craig and Quintin both talked about, when they started their projects and why they did them. I started thinking about carbon as an opportunity for school trust lands back in 2012, and I'll tell you, my holy grail is to do something on the North Shore, but having some real difficulties advancing any kind of projects or any discussions on the North Shore. So I started working with TNC, the Nature Conservancy, a few years ago, and we're looking for grant opportunities to actually do a study. We were selected through the Natural Climate Solutions Accelerator grant program that's administered by the Nature Conservancy and funded from the Doris Duke Foundation. And that project is really to leverage, as it says up here, that's the title, Leveraging State Forest Trust Lands for Carbon Opportunities. It involves Dovetail Partners, the Nature Conservancy, the DNR Resource Assessment Shop, NRI, and obviously this Office of School Trust Lands. And really as I said, we're at the initial stages. We're trying to figure out the modeling and create modeling so that we can advance or at least identify what our opportunities are for carbon sequestration on our forests. So of that 1.5 million acres that I said we had of productive forest lands, we're looking to identify up to 3 potential projects, roughly 20,000 acres in size. And We're also looking to expand that out to some of our sister states that have school trust lands, mainly in the Intermountain West. And there's roughly 10 million acres in the Intermountain West of state trust lands. And we're developing the model so that not only Minnesota can use it, but some of our sister states. And I think that was a big selling point to the NCSA grant scorers, if you will. So that we finished the modeling, I would say back in the spring. And really we have 3 models, and I'm not showing it here, but there's a bronze, a silver, and a gold model, actually 2 silver models. But really what we're looking at is, in the bronze model, is your publicly accessible data that we have right now, which is, you know, the fuzzed FIA data and some of the Minnesota inventory data. When you move into the other models, we keep adding layers of information or data so that we can make more informed decisions. And that includes aerial photography, low density LiDAR, high density LiDAR, and things of that nature. And then we display those on this open source software like Google Earth Engine. And I don't have the ability to show you that today, but we do have it available. So the other states are very appreciative of looking at that, and in particular Oregon, who's dealing with the Elliott State Forest out there, and they're looking to do a carbon project as well. So we're working hand in glove with Oregon on their LiDAR data and how to do those modelings. But just real quick, the initial just and a couple of graphs here just to show you what the difference in the models look like. So and this is off of 1 pixel in the model that we did in Cass County, where we had all of the available data, including the high density LiDAR. And you can see in the bronze models, you know, we were estimating, you know, carbon stocks of somewhere around, you know, 15 to 17 metric tons per acre. Same with the silver B model, which doesn't have the high density LiDAR. But when you get into the better data with the high density LiDAR and the silver A and the gold models, you can see that those models are showing that we're storing, or we have the potential to store considerably more carbon than what the other model showed. And the gold model in particular in Cass County shows that we're storing over 40. We have the potential to store over 40 metric tons per acre. And then the graph that's just below that is the confidence intervals between the models. And you can see in that Cass model, confidence interval is very, very tight for the gold model, not as tight for the silver A model. And then the reason we're not showing the bronze model here is because it would be off the charts. So the point that I wanted to make here really was that it's all about the data and making sure that you have really good high density LiDAR data so you can get the best assessment for yourself. So the one thing that I think that you've heard from UPM and from Molpus is that you can do timber and carbon projects. It's a reality, and I've heard time and time again that it's an either or, and I want to get us to the and portion of it from the school trust lands perspective. So just end real quick with this. It is only an assessment for these, you know, 3 20,000 acre blocks. We're not making a decision. We haven't made a decision, and those decisions will be made through the state's forest management planning aspect. And just from a challenge standpoint real quick is we learned early on that we did not have authority to get into carbon markets or into ecosystem service markets for that matter. I actually worked with the Legislative Permanent School Fund over the last couple of years to pass legislation. So there's 3 pieces to it. One is my job duties are mainly statutory. So I asked them to update my job duties in statute and require that our 25-year framework that I mentioned before includes ecosystem service markets. And then we also got authority to issue conservation planning leases and issue conservation easements. So we have that authority now. That was one of our major hurdles at the outset that we identified. So we've taken care of that, and we those bills were signed into law this session. So with that, I am done. There's my contact information, and I think we can pass it on to Mr. Gibeault.
Okay, great. Thank you, Aaron. Again, I'm really happy to see the questions coming in, and it looks like someone's posted a couple of replies there too, which is wonderful. Please keep those coming. And we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is great. But Forrest, Gibeault, you've got plenty of time here. We've scheduled until 10:10 the panel presentations, but if we wrap a little bit early, we can take that break and then come back and do questions on whatever timing makes the most sense. But Forrest, the screen is yours. You can share your screen whenever you're ready. I see that you're unmuted.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Thanks, Eli.
We can. The slides are displaying properly, and so you're on.
All right, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I've been bringing a little bit different perspective here. As you'll learn, we work for a diversity of both landowners and clients within the carbon space. As Craig alluded to earlier, we've helped them on their forest carbon project, helping them perform forest inventory and verification services on their current project. And I'll touch on that a little bit more. But just a little background. I'm not going to go into a lot of background about our firm, but just to let you guys know, we are a nationwide firm. The part of the business that I manage falls under the analytics side of the business, the appraisal side of the business. Anything to do with the valuation of forest lands, of real estate itself, the analytics, the modeling, forest inventory falls under my responsibility at Steigerwaldt. So I'll just give a little background of how we got into the carbon space. So we've got a pretty long history, going all the way back to the Chicago Climate Exchange, that first voluntary market, which ceased selling credits back in 2010, I believe. So we started in 2008 and 2009, helping relatively small landowners access that new market. We brought quite a few projects and clients to that market. It was riddled with a lot of challenges, and at the end of the day, most of our clients weren't very successful. A lot of costs were encumbered, and very little revenue was received. So right from the beginning, carbon had a hard time in the Lake States because a lot of people had a bad taste in their mouth. Many kind of had that feeling of it being kind of a pyramid scheme. There are a lot of hands in the pot back at that time. Some may say there still is, but the reality is carbon had a tough start. So we have that perspective. As the California market and compliance market came online, we were helping project developers really early on with FES modeling, and helping them, build capacity of those technical services, trying to meet all the requirements that California had built into their program. So we started at different parts of the country helping with that kind of technical service as those developers were building capacity internally. And then, of course, the carbon inventory, as you've heard today. I mean, it's a significant task. It's expensive. It's very important. It's the base of most carbon programs presently approved through protocol in the various registries. Here you can see one of our foresters climbing a Sitka spruce in coastal Alaska. So we've got experience across North America and really have an interesting perspective. So as carbon was building over the past 10 years, we've really positioned our business around ecosystem services. A significant part of our business is now focused in carbon itself, as opposed to traditional forest services, as you think a forest consulting firm would do. We still do those traditional forest inventory, forest management, timber marking, etc. Those types of dirt services. But the future of forestry, the way we see it, is changing. So heavily vested in carbon over the past 10 years. So what do we do? We provide a range of services. We're trying to find a way to be a bit of a one-stop shop, which has been successful for us in a lot of other parts of our business. Inventory installation. We pride ourselves in being one of the best teams in the country. We've never had a project not pass verification. In most cases, they pass verification the very first try. I don't think we've had any of our projects not pass verification the first try. If they did, it was outside of our control. A lot of efforts with carbon and project verification. So we've worked within that space for a variety of clients, both on projects that we've installed and projects that we haven't. Project management. So a lot of these projects are getting older in their vintage. We've worked on a lot of projects that are now going into reporting period 6 and 7. And the reality is that now there's a lot of time under the belt, getting close to the project developer contract period. And we're taking on the responsibility of annual monitoring, the project management of those projects, primarily right now in the space of compliance, California Air Resource Board projects. Growth and yield modeling, like I'd mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of experience and depth here to do that kind of work. And something I'll touch on a little bit more, carbon quantification and project feasibility. At the beginning of what I'd say the new age of carbon, with the success of California's compliance market over the past 8 to 9 years, the project developers controlled a lot of that knowledge and expertise in-house. Well, that's changing. And we're trying to provide services to give people another look and different way of and perspective. Very similar to what Aaron had talked about, is trying to do your own internal research and figure out how does carbon work within your forest land base without having to work directly with maybe a project developer. Those are trends we're starting to see. And then, of course, as you've heard from both the property managers here today that are in carbon, harvest schedule. How do we manage our land base within the context of both forest carbon and traditional forest products? And that's a tough cat to skin, and optimization and different ways of looking at management decision making. It's something that a lot of foresters and land bases kind of got around. Didn't really want to hone in there and invest in those models. Well, really now, when you're in forest carbon, you really have, if you want to optimize your forest and the opportunity, you're going to really have to, embrace technology moving forward. So some of our clients. So a lot of our clients are the folks you heard from yesterday. We work with most of the project developers. We try to provide that turnkey service, to everything from helping them with initial inventory design, listing of projects, pulling all that together, all the way through inventory implementation, verification. We have a lot of landowners that are, obviously we are forest managers. We manage over 300,000 acres just in the state of Wisconsin alone. Previously, we've had offices in the East and managed TMO lands in Appalachia. Presently are not doing that, but we have a lot of perspective of helping them, landowners, make those decisions. So like I said earlier, feasibility studies, project management, forest management, that traditional forest management, that still is happening. And then the harvest scheduling as well is something that landowners just continue to want to see stepped up. Not because it's maybe something that has been on the list for a while. It's kind of almost a necessity. And then the verifiers, helping them with finding experts in the carbon space to work through verification efforts. So let's just talk a touch about our large corporate clients. Most of my world lives there and helping with acquisition and due diligence efforts around the country. And, you know, a lot of what landowners are challenged with today is, you know, well, how will carbon affect asset value? How do these carbon markets work? There's a lot of tough questions out there now. But the reality is all large landowners that have an investment in the country can no longer, you know, ignore forest carbon. It's a real market. It's another forest product, right? And the reality is, you know, they're going to have to consider forest carbon and are considering forest carbon when they build a DCF, a discounted cash flow model, when they're looking at trying to acquire timberlands. You just have to model in potential carbon inventory if it's a fit and if it's an opportunity for an asset that's not already encumbered, and if it is encumbered by carbon or other conservation easements and other layers of encumbrances. How do they all work together? And you just, even if carbon isn't something you plan to do, the other people looking to acquire lands are thinking about it. So you have to. It's another forest product. Again, it brings the optimization of scheduling right to the forefront. I'll just keep touching on that. It's something that continues to be an area that our clients continue to ask about, need more of, and something that I see as a huge opportunity in the consulting space. And then we talked, I know a few others talked about timberland appraisals, but from the appraisal standpoint, I would say we're pretty much on the cusp of any large land base. If you're going to do an appraisal, you're going to have to assume carbon is just a standard assumption. It's becoming that common in the marketplace, in the investment world, that it pretty much has to be considered in any modeling, any income approach work that happens in an appraisal assignment. So what are some of our the client challenges that we have? You know, like I'd mentioned, you know, how do you manage carbon alongside traditional forest products? I'd say most of our clients, I hate to say it, and a lot in the industry are a bit behind the curve yet. You know, they're trying to figure out how to do this. Everyone's doing it a bit, kind of a little bit off the cuff, learning as we go, which is a fine way to go. But at the end of the day, it continues to be a place where even before going into carbon, you know, how do we get ourselves prepared for carbon? When someone asks me that, the first thing I do is come back and say, make sure you are tight on your existing modeling and understanding of your forest management and harvest scheduling on your traditional products. Get that super tight before we even think about going and talking about an ecosystem service product like forest carbon. Project feasibility. Project developers do a great job, but I would say there's a lot that are wanting to do some studying themselves. And the reality is most landowners don't have those systems in place. They don't know how to quantify carbon. They may know enough about the calculations and have maybe built some models, but how does that equate to the various credits and the various programs? You know, the stocks of carbon on the land base isn't what you get to sell. There's, you know, pretty specific, detailed formulaic approaches to quantifying what is the standing stock carbon relate to then an actual ERT, for instance, in the voluntary market of being able to be brought to the marketplace. Those are things that a lot of folks don't understand, and it's a big challenge. The number of programs that we have in front of us, huge challenge. Now we're finding, you know, NCX, finite core, AFF, and all these others are coming on board. We're finding carbon rental, which I'd say, you know, more that 1 year kind of commitment type of work that's NCX is doing, decreasing term commitments from, you know, getting tighter and tighter with AFF and others from that 100 year to 40 year, now it being less. You know, all those things a large landowner now has to think about and say, well, how do I model all these? All the protocols are different. And then what is best for us? It is a really tough thing to answer. And you have to really whittle down and help those folks figure out what are the programs that are likely to fit you best. Let's narrow that down to something that's reasonable, 2 or 3, and then let's start to model. And it's a pretty large exercise. You can certainly go to project developers that work within these spaces, and a lot do. But I would say there's usually what I'm finding is a combination of folks wanting to do internal research and analytics in addition to getting feasibility studies, if you will, from project developers, which are commonly a free service. The pressure of a new market, I think, is something that's really difficult for most long-term forest investment firms, TMOs, investors coming to the market space, because there's no trends. There's nothing we can base these decision makes, these, you know, what's the price assumptions? Where is the price been? Where is it going? It's a crystal ball kind of environment right now, which is such a new space that without trends, it creates a challenge to push something up the chain in a corporate structure. They're going to say, why now? Why didn't we do this 2 years ago? Why not 3 years from now? And the reality is so much changes on a daily basis to a monthly basis. It's really difficult to help people understand how is carbon going to be considered now. Now is the time for my land base, because there's no trends. And the reality is where we are in the voluntary space, none of us would have guessed where we are now 3 years ago. That's just a fact. So that fast changing environment of a new product is really difficult for folks that are used to long-term, specific to the lake states, historically pretty consistent traditional forest product pricing that you could count on. A lot of people come and invest in the lake states, not in a large part of their portfolio, but they come to the lake states because they want consistency in a safe place to put some of their investment funds. So when you're coming to that space, thinking about that in the lake states, and then thinking about new markets that create uncertainty and challenges that weren't there previous, it's tough for investors to wrap their mind around. And then I know I'm taking a bit, probably more time than what I have allotted, but this is my last slide. So just some of my some more high level experiential things. Project developers do a really good job of preparing landowners. I definitely have learned that. And they've done a better job year over year over year as they develop new projects. But with that said, post-developer planning, when that contract period is up, if you're working with a contractor, it's up to a landowner to really invest in learning and taking that experience for what it is. Learn, make sure you're part of the process, make sure you have a contract in which you can have access to the data. A lot of the modeling is proprietary to those specific developers, but most of that information you should have access to. All those year-end inventory and all those other things you should make sure you have access to and learn and understand how that inventory is being moved forward in the context of removals and all of the other program requirements and annual reporting and the quantification on an annual basis. In my experience, most landowners underestimate those technical and reporting tasks. And I am seeing in some cases where I'm in older vintage projects where they're in spot now where they're struggling. Of course, project developers are willing to extend contracts for certain services, but I think a lot of my at least I shouldn't say my clients, I've been seeing a lot of landowners around the country wanting to have more control over that. But I think a lot have underestimated what it takes to manage these projects long term. Costs overrun, specifically on inventory a lot of the time. Sometimes you're pushing up against some tight deadlines. You've got seasonality issues in the lake states. You can only operate in a cost-effective manner for a few months in some cases, in some parts of the country. You might be stuck in a position where you just have to push an inventory through and snow load, and production is going to be a third or less than what you had anticipated, and costs change in a similar manner. So those are things I commonly see happen. A lot of segments of the carbon services supply chain are overbooked too. You find that there's little service capacity right now. There's very little excess. There's so many projects coming to bear. I can tell you myself, we're beyond booked. It's just a really tough market right now. And of course, when you have tight service, you've got a high demand, services are tight, simple economics where costs are going to go. Protocol changes. You're going to have changes in, with California, ACR, voluntary markets, protocols change. You may be planning and assuming certain baseline assumptions in your models, and then all of a sudden protocols are changing before you get a project listed. Now all of a sudden your assumptions change. Now you got to start over with what you may be expecting in carbon revenue over that project timeline. So those are things that have caught people off guard. And then existing forest inventories, I would just leave it at that. A lot of challenges is that a lot of landowners may not have a great forest inventory. It's not up to date. They may not have a tree level inventory. It may be based on GIS and ocular estimates or long-term estimates tied to specific stands or strata. And it's like anything else, garbage in, garbage out on a feasibility study. And all of a sudden the project developer gives you this range of range of potential opportunity. And it's this huge, range. You're like, well, how could it be? Well, if you don't have great data, it's tough for them to give you a proposal that has high confidence. So buttoning up forest inventories, thinking about forest inventory well in advance of a carbon project is a big place that I've seen big opportunity with for forest landowners. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Forrest. All right, let's see where we are here. Okay, we are going to take a break. I am going to share my screen just so we can see the agenda together. I've adjusted it just a little bit. It's 10:03 by my clock right now. So we're going to take a break momentarily. That's going to be a 15-minute break. I think it's important for us just to clear our minds a little bit, get away from the screen. So we'll reconvene at 10:20. You have a couple of options: set a timer on your phone or whatever, or just leave Zoom open if you're at your computer, and you can you'll hear us talking again. But again, we'll reconvene at 10:20. Lots of time to add more questions. There are a number of questions already posted, but there's room for many more, and I'd love to see those. Again, 10:20 until about 11 or a few minutes after. We were originally scheduled until 11:15, so we do have that time. I've adjusted that down a little here just as an estimate, but we'll do Q&A from 10:20 until 11 or a few minutes thereafter. So thanks to all of our panelists. Excellent presentations. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes for Q&A. Any questions? I'm going to step away for a minute here myself, but I will be watching the chat if you have any questions about process or timing or anything like that. And I will add the Q&A link to the chat as well. Thanks, everybody. See you in 15 minutes at the end of break. Resume recording, and I want to pull up my Slido screen. Actually, it's going to take me just a minute to pull this up so that I can display it to you, but there's no reason for you all to wait. Let's go into our first question. First question is for all of the presenters, and it's about inventory. Can you describe the forest carbon inventory plots and how they differ from traditional forest inventory? Anyone want to jump on that?
I think I nominate Forrest.
There you go, Craig. Sure. So in most cases, with regards to the protocols that are requiring long-term maintenance of plots, the verification of those plots on a 5-year basis and re-inventory on a 10-year basis is pretty common. It's very similar to an FIA style plot. It's going to typically be a larger fixed plot with a nested plot for regeneration. A lot of information captured about total height, crown, obviously DBH. The big difference between a traditional forest inventory is that there is no margin for error. There is no threshold. There's not a half a foot for in-out trees. It's either in or out. It's black and white. DBH has to be handled in the same way. It's down, down to the 1/10 of an inch, and you need to follow generally the FIA diameter rules, and you got to move that tree and provide the diameter up that stem, provide notes for what you did. So a verifier can come in there and test your sample, and that you provide the information necessary for them to verify your calls on trees. A lot of cases, most cases, heights are all lasered, every single tree. There's very little error there. Most project developers are only going to, find maybe a 3 to 6 foot tolerance on heights. And that's anywhere in the country. That's pretty common. So the reality is there's just no threshold for error. It's either right or wrong. So the plots take a lot longer. There's a lot more data that's being captured in a traditional forest inventory for forest products or for management purposes. And a consultant like us, there's a lot of risk for us to install these plots in an really expedient manner, focusing on production. We're focusing on quality. That's the difference. We have to focus on quality. There just can be no error. There can be 40 trees on that plot. It's not okay for one of them to have an in-out tree called wrong. They have to all be right. And then you get into the mountains and you get into slope, and then every tree needs to be slope corrected. And then that brings into even another whole ball of worms, where if you're looking at slope, 1 or 2 degrees can make the difference between a tree being in or out. So the cost of those inventories is because of the precision. They are typically monumented with rebar and sub-meter GPS, some combination of one or the other, sometimes both. They're going to be revisited, sometimes for 100 years. They just need to be right. That's the expectation for most protocols.
And
Hey, Forrest, this is Aaron. Can I jump in here real quick, Eli?
Yeah.
I read the question a little bit differently, and I think the one thing that I've learned is the FIA plots, those fuzzed FIA plots are, it's one plot per X thousands of acres, whereas the plot requirements for these carbon projects are, one plot every 160 acres or something like that. I wonder if Forrest could talk about that for a second, because I don't know the exact answer.
Yeah, so most protocols with regards to that, the statistics around the inventory are obviously quite different. You're looking at statistics at the strata level rolling up to property. So in most cases, we're trying to shoot for a 90 to 95%. Typically a plus or minus 95 to 90% confidence inventory is typically what's happening. California compliance, you're losing credits for every a few percentage points outside of the minimum bounds. So obviously, much more intensive inventory. Typically, depending if say your average 40 to 50,000 acre carbon enrollment, we're typically looking at that 200 to 300 plots minimum range.
Thanks, Forrest and Aaron. Next question, it looks like it's for Craig. You mentioned the 60% in the carbon project. Can you talk a bit about how you decided on that 60% to include in the carbon project, and what considerations went in to not include the 40% Minnesota lands? So I'm going to add just a little bit to that, Craig. How'd you decide 60-40? And then once you had decided 60-40, how did you decide which acreage was in and which was out?
Okay. Yeah. So basically, it wasn't withholding any acreage due to possible land sale or future management or future harvesting. It was primarily dealing with obviously cover types that non-productive acreage, and also we had to be careful not to include areas that we already had under contract with the wood supply agreement that would have been harvested after the project was approved, that would automatically put us over primarily the clear cut size. So with those two things, that's how it got, down to only 60%.
Thanks, Craig. Next question for Quintin. How has climate adaptation fit into Blandin's planning for this carbon project? White spruce, while long-lived, is not a projected climate winner for the region. Are other species like white pine being considered too? And Quintin, I saw that you put a brief reply in there, but I wonder if you want to elaborate just a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, part of the process is that, is the diversity. And so, there's not going to be I think I had a slide in there that mentioned that too, that we're trying to move away from the plantations. And so where the white spruce would be planted in those native plant communities that it historically grew in, it never occurred in a plantation or in pure stands for the most part. Maybe I've seen a quarter acre white spruce pocket in a natural stand, and that's the most you ever saw. And so it's going to be managed more in a naturally occurring way when there is white spruce out there. And yeah, white pine is one thing we plant. We're planting, those long-lived conifers, white pine, red pine, that are best suited for the sites. And so that's part of what we're doing, is making sure what does best on those sites is growing on those sites, and then increasing the diversity whenever we can of the species that are out there. That would be how we are handling that.
Thanks, Quintin. Next question is for Aaron. Aaron, timber harvest is allowed on carbon projects. Do you have a sense of the level of forest management restrictions at this point if the Office of School Trust Lands was to pursue a project?
Yeah, good question, Mr. Meyer. The short answer to that is no, because we've just done the assessment or we're just working through the assessment of what our opportunities may or may not be. I think a different way to answer it is we're relying a lot on the sustainable timber harvest analysis to determine what our allowable cut is. We know that we're actually growing more than we're cutting on school trust lands. And from what I've learned, just through this project is that we actually could receive, but we potentially could receive a payment for what we are not cutting. So right now, school trust timber harvest, somewhere in the 400 to 420,000 cords annually. I think we're growing close to 600,000 cords annually. So I think we can get paid for the difference that we're not cutting. But we do not know what restrictions may or may not come out of a project.
Great. Here's a sort of financial analysis question, and the question's directed to Craig, but I wonder if this might be one for Forrest to follow up on afterwards. So Craig, first, did Molpus do a cash flow model, harvest versus carbon credits for the 100 years? It's a long duration contract. And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about how you modeled that.
Yeah, of course we did a cash flow model, as we do a very in-depth acquisition model at time of acquisition. So we're constantly modeling cash flow as a TMO. Again, as Aaron alluded to, we didn't engage in a carbon credit project to stop harvest. That was not any intent. We do not plan to do that long term. I don't believe we modeled this out for 100 years. We can't foresee future prices and markets out to 100 years, but we did model it shorter term, 10-year, with the assumptions that market prices and markets remain fairly stable. So you got to take that with a grain of salt because markets do change. I guess what it does do is it gives you a lot of flexibility if for our clients' assets, if a mill does go down and stumpage falls to a price that's below what you would receive for a carbon payment, that would allow you to adjust there. But as far as modeling, you've got to be pretty careful here because if you go out too long term, something's going to change and you've spent a lot of effort for nothing. So hope that answers Jason's question. But
Vandy submitted this one. Forrest, do you have anything to add to that? I guess the reason I'm looking to you is one, you talked a little bit about the financial side of this, and two, you actually said something that I almost asked about. You said that before doing the carbon sort of modeling, you really have to have your timber harvest scheduling dialed in. You said something to that effect.
Right.
And I was wondering why that is. I mean, certainly you would look at, Vandy's asking about cash flow. You would look at balancing or hedging or looking at these two sources of revenue together and kind of optimizing the two streams together. So first of all, any comments on that? And then second, why is it so important to have your timber harvest scheduling really dialed in before you then look at carbon? Simply to manage complexity or something else?
Yeah, I guess my point there was in regions where forest product markets are very strong and healthy, which is the majority of the lake states, even with carbon, the forest products are going to be an important part of maximizing net present value on any asset. To Craig's point too, yeah, modeling out beyond 40 years, future revenues discounted back are so meaningless. The reality is, yeah, it doesn't pay to go up much beyond 20 years in most cases. But the reality, my point was there is just to make, a lot of folks don't, other than say, this is what we cut last year, we think growth is this, and this is what we're putting on the books, without tying it back specifically to stands and strata. And you need to be to stands and strata when you introduce carbon if you want to optimize. So I guess I'll just leave everybody with this learning that I found is that when you've got strong forest products, California compliance in most of the voluntary marketplace, forest products are going to outpace the value of forest carbon growth credits in the future. So when you've got strong forest products, in most cases, most lands are just going to optimize the initial tranche or the baseline credits initially, and then thereafter, it typically tells you to cut as close to or growth if you can. That's a big challenge. Most landowners think they're cutting growth, most aren't anywhere near it. And the reality is that the models and maximizing NPV with traditional forest products and carbon in most parts of the lake states will tell you take the initial tranche and cut growth in the future and not plan on taking growth credits in carbon. That's what the models typically tell you.
That's interesting.
It's different in other places. We get to the West where you don't have strong markets. It'll be very different.
Thanks, Forrest. Next question is the clear cut is just a technical point, Craig, directed to you. Is the clear cut restriction an average clear cut size must be less than 40 acres, or can no clear cut be over 40 acres?
Easy answer, no clear cut can be over 40 acres. And the definition of a clear cut, I believe, is anything below residual 50 square feet basal area. So right. unlike SFI, no clear cut can average over 40 acres, which means if you want to be sure that you better have something on the ground to contain that to be below 40 acres. And that leads to my comments of planning and field work increases greatly because you have to put more lines out in the out in the forest to make sure you have enough stoppers so that you don't have a mistake of going over 40 acres. And that is all evaluated at the end of a reporting period when you send all your shape files of your harvest, and they look at, I'm sure they're looking at detection change through, air photography or imagery.
And maybe this is not of interest, I don't know, but I'm curious as a technical matter. Could you have a 60-acre clear cut, but that's in two separate units? You might sell it as a single 60-acre sale, but it's in two disjunct units with impact forest in between.
Yeah, important key point that I had in my notes, but I missed it. So Eli, you picked up on it. You have to have at least 300 feet in between cuts. So that's the buffer. So yes, to your point, Eli, you can have 100 acres as long as you have 300 feet in between, uncut in between those polygons.
Yep. Thanks, Craig. And another one coming your way that I think
I just added that, Eli, for a quick moment.
Yeah.
So that's specific to a specific protocol to make things more complex. So earlier projects, earlier protocols don't have as stringent. So that's the complexity of all the protocols and all the programs. They're all different fruit. They're similar, but the reality across the carbon universe, all those requirements are different.
That's important, Forrest. In 2015, as Forrest just mentioned, that the rules changed, and maybe they'll change again. So, that's exactly.
It will.
Yeah.
Forrest, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, it's a good point. So it would be a mistake for folks to take that as sort of the gospel that you can never have a clear cut more than 40 acres. It depends on the protocol and so on. Similar sort of question, technical thing, Craig or others. How does it work if Molpus decides to sell land within the 99-year carbon project encumbrance?
We cannot sell small parcels within the footprint. Of course, you can sell the entire footprint, and whoever would purchase it would fall under the encumbrance of all the carbon rules. And thus that this is the reason why we went and had an appraisal opinion on what that carbon project would do to your asset value.
Great. I'm going to rely on audience members. If there's something that you want to you'd like these folks to elaborate on, let us know. You can post another question or let us know through the chat or something. Aaron, this next one is for you. Will stands like old growth on school trust lands that are not in the timber pool and other areas of rare native plant communities, ENS species, etc., will they be looked at as a way the school trust can be compensated for the lack of harvest on these sites?
Yeah, that's, I would say yet to be determined. The way I understand it is that these old growth stands, they're not in our timber pool, right? So there's no threat of harvest, if you will. They're already storing carbon. They will continue to store carbon. I don't know if that's a way we can get compensated for school trust lands. And the way I'm reading this question or understanding the question is, if the school trust were to get an economic value from old growth through carbon credits, would that then remove the requirement for the state to compensate the school trust for the old growth designations that are reducing the revenue? And I think the answer to that is yet to be determined.
Thanks, Aaron. Next one's a general question. All of this conversation is without a national price on carbon. What changes with a national price on carbon in policy at $100 a ton for one thing, Craig's gonna be kicking himself for maybe for modeling that as a stable price. But any thoughts on that? Increased demand for the kinds of services that Forrest said were already running short. What else? Would change the balance between, Forrest said, it's still really timber that's going to be, a big part of your balance sheet, and maybe this changes that balance. But how would this all change with $100 price on carbon?
At $100 per CO2 equivalent, that would make timber products irrelevant pretty much everywhere. The reality is that all these programs are so different, there really can't be a price. The buyer, there's no exchange that's out there. You can't go to an exchange. This is seller to buyer market. It's a bit of the Wild West, and that's what frustrates landowners a lot too. It's hard to access the market. Blue Source and others have a cornerstone on the market itself because they have the relationship and they can sell a diversity of different credits that provide different values, are saving different critters, if you will, different ecosystems around the world. And the reality is they're building the story to sell these credits in the marketplace. And the better story they build with your asset, your timberlands, your credit is worth something to some buyer. So there's no exchange. So that's the challenge, is that until there's an exchange, that's the first thing that needs to happen. Then the second thing that needs to happen is that all of these programs need to get close, have to be on a similar playing field, which I don't see that happening anytime soon. So the reality is a one price in the marketplace works within a very structured framework of a marketplace, which does not exist in carbon right now. We're talking about decades into the future, if not longer, before I could even see that happen.
So Eli, can I just follow up with a
Yes,
question for Forrest?
do.
Because I've heard rumor that the USDA is looking at this national price for carbon and thinking about putting it in the farm bill. And I just wanted to know if there was any truth to that rumor. This is the first I've heard of $100 per ton, but that changes the economics considerably if it's right now in the voluntary market at roughly $7 a ton.
And Forrest, just what would that even look like? What would it mean to establish a national price on carbon? I think what you're saying is you have to have an exchange, and they all need to be, in a sense, something like a commodity where they're all the same. And you're saying,
right, and the
really not all
protocols,
the same.
yeah, the program and protocol would have to be, the same across the board to have the same equivalent price, right? You'd have to have the same encumbrance on these properties for the same number of years, the same expenses and costs and monitoring requirements. And that's not the case across the board. So, maybe with the exchange, there could be a base price that's adjusted based on all the various protocols that could be set through some systematic way to adjust for that, all the different programs that are providing some additionality. And right now it's a bit of the Wild West. You have two things happening. You have, the NCXs of the world, and you've got a lot of the traditional carbons of the world, fighting over, well, what credit is truly showing additionality and which is doing a better job of doing what we're trying to do with forest carbon. And it's a bit of a battle that's happening with a couple different approaches to quantifying a credit to sell into some marketplace. So there's a lot of challenges there. I don't know specifically about the bill and this $100 price, but it seems like a long shot, because functionally for it to work in the marketplace, I just don't see it happening very easily at all.
Good question. Thanks, Anonymous. Craig and Quintin, how does the concept of additionality play in? Are you receiving credits for any net increase in carbon storage above the baseline or the kind of day one, day zero, whatever? Are you receiving credits for any net increase in carbon storage or an estimated difference between actual and business as usual? In other words, only a difference that's attributable to changes you made in your management. And I see that your reply was, I think, on the former. So it's not just about additionality based on particular practices that have been adopted. Looks like it's based on, any net increase in carbon stored on your ownership. Am I interpreting that right? And do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's correct. And no, I don't have anything to add.
Craig, same deal under your program?
Well, yeah, no, I think Forrest hit on it. It's, you're paid an initial payment for your carbon stocks that you have as an inventory, and your payments going forward are your carbon stocks for any volume under what you're growing per year. I mean, it's difficult. That I don't know how to explain it. And how does the concept of additionality play in? I'm not really sure what they're getting at, but I think the question was kind of answered.
Okay. Aaron, can you talk about how 20,000 acres was chosen for potential project size? A previous state land carbon assessment showed the return on investment for larger projects, 100,000 acres, but less so for smaller projects. Has this changed? Aaron, you're muted.
Unmute. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks for the question, Amanda. And I think it has changed. I think the previous assessment that was done by DNR Forestry back in, I think it was 2014, 2015, showed exactly that you needed 100,000 acres to get a return on investment. I believe that was based on, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was based on roughly a $3 to $5 range. So $3 for every metric ton per acre. Right now, the voluntary markets are in the 7 to 8 range. The last I heard. So I think it has changed to some extent. But the 20,000 acres was just a proposal. Those 3 separate 20,000 acre blocks was a proposal to the grant writers. That's how we wrote our grant, and they accepted it. So we stuck with it.
Thanks, Aaron. Forrest, how do changes in the price, compliance or voluntary, affect current contracts? Is there typically a mechanism for the value of the carbon market to adjust?
Sure, if I'm interpreting this right, in a lot of cases, a contract with a project developer would include sometimes a minimum price threshold. So a landowner would not be willing to sell carbon into the market in any given year unless it hit a minimum price threshold. Then it's up to the project developer to find the buyer in the marketplace that can, meet or exceed that threshold price. It wasn't that common years ago. Now I would say it's a pretty common threshold. In most cases, project developers are providing a proposal or feasibility study in which revenues and kind of a pro forma into the future during at least their contract period, they're going to be using a pretty conservative price there, looking to beat it on a given year. So there is obviously a difference in price between compliance and voluntary, although I will say that recently, the past year or two and past few months, I mean, they're getting closer and closer. So they are starting to converge in some cases for some projects that developers are confident in or know they have buyers for a specific type of forest credit.
Thanks, Forrest. Got a couple more questions here. Can you all please describe how you use aerial and satellite imagery in your day-to-day operations? Include sensors and revisit frequency. I think Quintin told us that, and maybe Craig too, there's every 5 years you got to be on the ground. How does remote sensing fit into monitoring? We heard about change detection, at least used by verifiers. I don't see anyone jumping to unmute. There you go, Craig.
Well, I think imagery and satellite imagery, I refer to it as a tool of the verifiers because they don't come out on the ground every year. They need to verify that the polygons you send in of your harvest are actually, and I can't speak for a verifier, but I'm sure they take a subset and start measuring with a measuring tool, look at the polygons of the harvest you sent in and look at current photography or satellite imagery to double check that their calculations are under 40 acres as well. And your adjacency is within the parameters. That's my guess.
I would just add that I think to answer the question is a little bit differently. Groups like NCX, formerly Sylvia Terra, they're using their base map technology. You can do a lot of research on I'm sure everybody's really familiar with it here. They're using that as the basis of their inventory to detect changeover on an annual basis. So obviously they're using something very novel. I will say that even within the California compliance, there is new methods and methodologies using LiDAR for quantification, for stratification, eventually for likely, somewhat replacing plots on the ground. There are groups that are working on that too. So the reality is I expect 5 years, 10 years from now, fewer and fewer plots likely installed on the ground. Technology, access to technology such as LiDAR, quantification of carbon using those technologies is becoming more open source, expected part of the industry. And I only expect to see this type of technology continue to grow in use.
Thanks, Forrest. Next question is for Aaron. Interesting question. Can you describe how trust in traditional DNR lands, school trust and traditional DNR lands may differ in terms of management in light of future carbon demands? And I'm going to guess that by traditional DNR lands, they're talking about DNR forestry lands as opposed to WMAs or other things like that. But any thoughts, Aaron?
I don't have a lot of thoughts on that. I can say under the sustainable timber harvest analysis, the school trust lands that were included in that are set up under what's called the standard forestry regime. So they're managed sustainably like all the other DNR lands. I think there's some additional restrictions on wildlife administered lands or other types of lands that DNR may manage. The purpose of doing this assessment and developing these models wasn't solely so that we could use it on school trust lands, but so that we could use it on all the lands. And just to get back to that other question, on remote sensing and things like that, I don't use it every day, but I know that DNR Resource Assessment Shop, who's part of this project, uses it. And I rely on their expertise for that. But my understanding is that it could be these models could be applied across other DNR managed lands.
Great, thank you. Let's see, where do we want to go next here? We've got a few. Let's talk a little bit about penalties, I guess. What are the penalties if you make a mistake on your inventory or harvest sizes?
I can't address the harvest sizes, but I don't think there's going to be a mistake on the inventory. That'd be pretty tough to have because it's checked. So Forrest talked about that, is that the number of plots you put in based on what you have out there, you're in that 90-95% confidence interval. And then when the verifier comes out and rechecks those plots, there, like he said, there isn't a lot of room for discrepancies there. The picture I showed, that's why they're out there with the contractor as well. So we not only paid the contractor to go out and make those measurements, the contractor was there to say, okay, because they're marking where they're measuring DBH on all those trees, so that there's no question, and then there's a debate about, well, how did you treat this tree? Is it 2 stems or 1 stem? All of that, the protocol, like Forrest mentioned too, is very restrict, or I don't want to say restrictive, but very precise to limit that. And like I said, it's checked and it's double checked. So I don't think you're going to have a mistake. But then, it's maybe not asked in here, but it kind of, I think, fits, is there's a buffer that's set aside for and primarily for whether it's a fire or a windstorm, something like that. If something were to happen, there's a buffer that you're required to set aside that isn't available.
Anyone?
Yeah,
Anything to add? Go ahead, Forrest.
that's a really good, point. Quintin did a good job summarizing there with regards to the inventory side. And just remember, if your inventory is based on your plots, it's based on those plots in the future too. So as those plots change, it's based on the baseline of the initial plot. So there's very little risk to it, not being representative of what's on the ground, because what's used in the carbon quantification is the plots themselves. And that's why they have the high standard of confidence that is required, because they want to make sure that it does truly reflect the individual strata and the forest. There's a buffer, and then there are required, if you just set aside credits for every credit you sell in the marketplace for the insurance pool, if you will, which Quintin is alluding to. But that's for these acts of God, right, that happen outside your control. But you also can choose to hold back credits from sale initially, holding back your own pool of credits, planning into the future when let's say you may be cutting into growth because you want to get aspen age class distribution fixed in a certain region, and you're going to be cutting and getting negative over a period of time, which may trigger an involuntary issue where you've got you're outside of protocol. But if you're saving credits and you can pay for those credits in the future, keeping a pool from your initial pool of credits is a very common thing that people do, just as an extra layer of insurance, if you will. And I'd say most do, especially large projects. Large projects give you the opportunity of having more flexibility because your project can absorb those changes over time across the various forest types and forest inventory. If your project is smaller, has a less diversity of forest management, it creates a little bit more risk year-over-year change, where in those cases, having that set aside is really important.
Thanks. Pretty straightforward question here for Aaron. For lands put under a carbon project encumbrance, are there hindrances to minerals exploration and/or development? I would think maybe there are, but Aaron, thoughts?
Yeah, I believe you're right, Eli. I believe there would be some prohibition on mineral exploration or development. I can't say for sure because I haven't seen a contract or any kind of conservation easement regarding it, so I can't speak to it that well. I will say that the way we've approached this project is under an improved forest management project. So when we're looking at it and we're working through the criteria on how we would identify those 3 20,000 acre project sites, we looked at understock stands, disease stands, and then some locations, and none of those locations were in a known mineralized zone. So we're trying to avoid those areas.
Anyone else have anything to add on that one? All right, I want to go next to another good question here. A lot of good questions coming from Jason Meyer today. Question for any of you is anyone receiving carbon credits for species conversion, which is different from standard regeneration strategy? The example he gives is if aspen is the current standard, it's short-lived, and produces paper. Converting that instead to oak, which would typically produce longer lived wood products. And there's another question that I'll just mention here, that's related. James Gray put a question in: do forest carbon projects somehow count or consider the carbon that's harvested and sequestered in long-term forest products? And actually, I'm realizing as I read that second, so James's question is really fully about products. Maybe I was misreading Jason's, and maybe not, I don't know. Aspen itself is both short-lived, and the products it typically produces is short-lived. Whereas oak lives longer and also typically produces longer lived products. So any thoughts on that, on credits for changing your management to favor longer lived species that produce those products? And as well as James's simpler question about, do any of these projects count carbon that's harvested and sequestered in long-term forest products? And I think we heard that the other day that maybe they do. Can anyone speak to that?
Sure, I got it. So, part of our improved forest management was longer lived conifer species. That was part of it. And so instead of, a pure aspen stand, we're doing the mixed wood where it's, we're increasing the biological diversity, but we're having the softwoods in there as well. So that's one of them. So it's not a conversion per se, because those spruce would have occurred there naturally. There wasn't a seed source anymore, or pine for that matter, but not, aspen to oak, no, but just in terms of adding another species to increase, some longer lived species. Yeah, you get some credit for that. And for James's, yes, that is true, is that the harvested wood products are part of the calculation that is done.
And Quintin, the other day you gave just a little bit more detail that I think might be of interest. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Right. So when we go through a verification, we have to, and I think Craig talked about the scale slips. So we had to report all of that to all the markets, so that when they're doing that verification, or even our developers is putting the numbers together for us, they're looking at the products that it's going into, and there's the life expectancy on those. And so it's small compared to the the carbon, the sequestration, the growth that we're getting out there, but it's still a factor in that calculation and as part of your carbon credits that you're receiving.
Thanks, Quintin. All right, let's do a couple more questions here, and we're wrapping up, and it's perfect. We're right about on schedule too. And we may have already discussed this one early on. Another question from Vandy: does your investment group, this is for Craig, does your investment group consider this a price hedge versus harvest return? I think we heard a little bit about kind of just balancing these two sources of revenue, but Craig, anything to add to that?
Yeah, initially we didn't, and Forrest did a good job of answering this. Actually, is in most cases your timber revenue will surpass what you can get, even if you allow it sitting on the stump. So really, when we did our modeling, we maximized our harvest and minimized what carbon we would be receiving on an annual basis. Do we consider it as a price hedge? I don't really think so. I think what we did initially, we looked at areas, and I mentioned this in my presentation, areas that had markets that were very thin, and or distance to a mill where prices were low. I think we looked at it more as not a hedge on our forest management, but a hedge that our markets may go away somehow. And we're just protecting our client's asset that way. I don't know if that answered it or not.
I would say that in most regions with strong wood products, most large landowners are considering it really no different than a conservation easement. it's a windfall of cash, right? Because you're mainly getting that payment in that initial tranche of credit. Where, to Craig's point, and what I've seen through research, is you're still wanting to maximize harvest. And, so the growth credits over time in most protocols, just, you're deferring those and cutting traditional products. So if you really peel everything apart, it's really no different than a conservation easement.
That's an interesting, that's interesting, Forrest. All right, and I think that brings us to the end of the questions here. There is one more question about how to manage for moose. I think, unless someone has something they want to put in there, I think that's a little bit outside the scope of today. Moose, of course, are generally, well adapted to large, high severity disturbances and large clear cut sizes, which isn't really compatible with a 40-acre minimum. And then we have a comment here about a reference to price on carbon. This person is suggesting that there's good reason to think that the value of carbon might well increase well beyond its current level. Interesting. And again, if anyone wants to respond to either of those, wave at me or something, but I think those, I'm not sure we need to respond to them directly. So this brings us very close to the end of our program. I am going to share my screen if I can in a slightly different way. I'll go back to the agenda here. First of all, I need to thank our panelists. This has really been wonderful. I really appreciate the four of you taking time to prepare your remarks and also to share those with us today. I'm trying to find my little clapping hand here. There you go. But that was really very good. And I appreciate as well you're sticking around for a long list of, I think, really insightful and good questions and terrific answers from all of you. So thank you again very much for that to all of our panelists. I also want to thank participants. Goodness, with the questions really covered a lot of ground. I think it was really a very good conversation that we had this morning. And I appreciate all of you getting involved and posting questions, voting them up, responding in some cases, and so on. That was really very helpful. I personally, my perspective on events like this, I think they're a lot better when we have the whole community kind of in conversation rather than just kind of one or a small group of experts up front and everyone else just listening. And I think the questions and comments that you all added really added a lot to the program. So thank you to the audience as well. Next up for us, so we're going to wrap this in a couple of minutes. I am going to email you all within an hour or so a couple of links. One is a link to the continuing education credit request form. So if you are attending this and interested in receiving continuing education credits, you just need to fill out a very simple form. You're probably familiar with it by now. And I can share that link in my email. I'm also going to share a link to an evaluation form. I hope to get that out quickly so that you can fill it out while it's on your minds. That'll take you 2 or 3 minutes, but it's important to us to receive those for a variety of reasons. Helps us with our reporting, and it's also important to us. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on an event like this. We'll have a question in there about the Zoom format. We're limited in what the university allows us to do with respect to in-person programming. We all know Zoom has its downsides, but I think this has also been a very effective use of, or effective, good way to gather under the circumstances. And I'd like your feedback, whether you agree or have ideas for how we should do things like this differently and better in the future. So look for that evaluation form. Also, some of you, as I said earlier, are going to join us tomorrow at the Cloquet Forestry Center, just down the road here. I'm in Cloquet now for the field tour. Watch, those of you who have registered for the field tour, watch for an email from me with details about where to meet and so on. I will note that we are not serving lunch tomorrow. It is bring your own food. Often at SFEC events, we do have a box lunch, but given the timing of the tours today and so forth, we have decided not to do that. So 9 a.m. to noon or 1 to 4. We'll be walking to 4 different kinds of stands and talking about some of the practices that we heard about yesterday, the Enhancing Future Forest practice, and I don't remember the name of the other one through the Family Forest Carbon Program, but a couple of different practices, how those might play out, and looking, and obviously carbon offset credits are determined at scales much larger than individual stands. But the idea tomorrow is that we'll be walking through some stands and looking at kind of a collection of stands that's at least typical of this region, and thinking about how that all those different forest types and plant communities and silvicultural decisions would together aggregate into a carbon project. And so we'll be walking around talking about the programs and how they play out in stands like these. It's supposed to be a beautiful day. You can still register if you haven't yet and you're interested, and I'm looking forward to that. Any questions about any of that, drop me a line anytime. Do look for an email if you've registered for that with details about where to go and when. And I think that's what we've got. I think that brings us to the end of the program. We are coming right up to our time. Matt, anything that I have forgotten to mention or anything that you would like to add into the discussion? Matt Russell?
I don't think so, Eli. That's a good summary, and thanks to the panelists for all their time today. This has been great.
Yeah, I agree.
Eli, I just got one comment. This is Craig with Molpus. Anybody interested in looking at Molpus Woodlands Group management or anything related to carbon, you can either find it on our website, or we have a lot of posts on LinkedIn about our management and about our carbon projects. So if you go to either one of them resources, you can find a lot more about Molpus Woodlands Group than I shared with you.
Great. Thanks for mentioning that, Craig. Those are all going to be easy to find for folks. Matt did include a link earlier in the chat, and I think a lot of folks are on LinkedIn as well. So appreciate your mentioning that. All right, panelists, again, thank you. Thanks again to the Minnesota Forest Resources Council for supporting this series. We'll see many of you in the woods tomorrow. For others, if you remain interested in forest carbon, we're going to have what I know is going to be a good tour. We'll be up on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest with Brian Palak and his colleagues, looking at really focusing in on silviculture and its relationship to stand level forest carbon. That is October 14th. Information on that event is on the SFEC website. And then our Minnesota Forests and Carbon series concludes in early November with a series of 3-hour-long webinars about the use of technology in forest carbon assessment. 3 excellent speakers that I know that'll be good too. So again, you can find that information on our website. Thanks again, everybody. This has been great. See you all at a similar event soon.
Thanks,
I'll leave
Eli.
the meeting open. You bet. I'll leave the meeting open just for a few minutes in case any questions come in, but appreciate your coming.